Good evening, everyone. I'm Abby Seidner. I'm the Executive Director of the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network here at NYU Law. So thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's virtual book talk. This is the final book talk in our series for the semester. And we're so thrilled tonight to welcome Sarah Vogel, who is an NYU Law alum and the author of The Farmer's Lawyer, The North Dakota Nine, and the Fight to Save the Family Farm. And we're also thrilled that she is here tonight in conversation with a wonderful, beloved fixture at the law school, Bert Newborn, who is the Norman Dorsey Professor of Civil Liberties Emeritus at NYU Law. So before we get started, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors for tonight's talk. We have NYU's Institute for Public Knowledge and NYU Law's State Energy and Environmental Impact Center. The Farmer's Lawyer is the true story of Sarah Vogel's legal battle to stop the federal government from foreclosing on thousands of family farmers in North Dakota. Before we dive in, we have a few logistics. Captioning is available via the caption feature, and we welcome your questions. We'll have time for Q&A, so please submit questions in the Q&A box and we'll get to as many as we can. We also strongly encourage all of you to buy and read this incredible book. So we will be linking to a page with more information about the book in the chat. So now I am so thrilled to introduce tonight's moderator, Professor Bert Newborn, who is the Norman Dorsey Professor of Civil Liberties Emeritus at NYU Law and a visiting professor at Berkeley Law. At NYU, he taught a variety of courses from procedure to federal courts to a First Amendment seminar, and he is also the founding legal director of the Brennan Center for Justice and has been one of the country's foremost civil liberties lawyers for more than 50 years. Professor Newborn graduated with an AB from Cornell and an LLB from Harvard Law School. We are incredibly thrilled to have him moderating tonight's conversation. So with that, I will turn it over to him and we'll get the conversation started. Thanks, Professor Newborn.
Thank you, Abigail. I'm delighted to moderate a program for the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network, both because I respect very much what it does, but also because Sheila Birnbaum was my dear friend and colleague when I was teaching at NYU, especially in the early years. And she helped me very much get on my feet as a teacher. And so it's with real pleasure that I salute Sheila today. I thought it would be useful before introducing Sarah Vogel, who is a heroine and whom you all should get to know because she's a remarkable person. The background for the book. This is a book really that was driven by the slow erosion of the family farm in American life. The fact that the backbone of many of the ethical rules and guidelines that govern our country are derived from the hard work and effort of family farmers. And slowly but surely, throughout the 20th century, the family farm became an economically endangered unit in certain settings, not because of any intrinsic inefficiency, but because of terrible economic and social policy, which put the family farm at risk and accelerated the sale of farmland in the United States from family farmers to large agribusiness interests controlled by corporations. It was that movement that I think triggered Sarah's passion to try to push back against the slow erosion of the family farm. Now, usually the bad guy, the villain in this story, is a bank, a private bank that forecloses on the family farm and forces the family farm off the land. And that's often the case. But in this book, much to my surprise, when Sarah brought it to my attention, it wasn't some private bank. It was the government itself that was driving the family farmer off the land. And they were doing it through an agency, a New Deal agency, the Farmers Home Administration, that was created in the New Deal to try to protect small family farmers by providing them both with advice about the latest agricultural events and credit, cheap credit, as an alternative to the banking system. And during the late 1960s and early 70s, the geniuses in our national security units decided that food could be a geopolitical weapon, and that since the United States produced so much food, we could use food the way other countries use oil or natural gas as a way of influencing the way the rest of the world behaves. We would use our food as a kind of blackmail. And so they wanted to encourage American farmers to produce more and more and more material. And in the early 70s, they threw money at the family farm. The local advisors from the Farmers Home Administration advised them to take on more and more and more debt at very, very favorable credit that was given by the federal government. So you increased your acreage, you increased everything you did. The theory was the more food we produced, the more powerful we would be in the world. And then along came the oil shock. And a radical change in the credit markets. And interest, which had been down at about 4.5% and 5%, skyrocketed up to between 20 and 22%. And the Farmers Home Administration lent this money on adjustable rate mortgages. So over and over again, they lifted the interest rates so that these poor farmers were trying to pay off huge debts with 20 and 23% annual interest rates. I mean, the mafia couldn't have done worse. They couldn't, the farm itself was still an economically viable unit, but they couldn't make it on the interest rates. And the Farmers Home Administration foreclosed on the farms, and agribusiness bought the farms up. Enter Sarah Vogel. Enter Sarah Vogel, the heroine of this story. Sarah is from Bismarck, North Dakota. Graduated from the University of North Dakota, and then made her way to the big city and graduated from NYU Law in 1970. She is the first woman to ever serve as a agricultural commissioner of the state. She served 2 terms as the agricultural commissioner of the state of North Dakota. She was a mainstay of the Democratic Nonpartisan League, which is the old what's left of the old great La Follette movement in this country. The prairie populist movement in this country is the Nonpartisan League. She received a lifetime award from the Nonpartisan League in 2015, and she founded an organization called Marketplace of Ideas, which is and was the principal think tank for economic policy for rural America, something that everybody forgets. They don't really think through the economic policy for rural America to try to reinforce the family farm. And she founded this organization, and it continues to be one of the major sources of ideas in the area. So it is with that great pleasure and great joy that I introduce my friend, my colleague, my co-counsel, and one of my heroines, Sarah Vogel. Welcome.
Thank you. That was an amazing introduction. And one of the highlights of my work on the Coleman versus Block case, which was the case we talked about, was working with you and Alan Canner. And, it was, you came along like a hero with a cape.
So tell us, Sarah. The book is The Farmer's Lawyer, the North Dakota Nine, and the Fight to Save the Family Farm. Tell us a little bit about the book and why you decided to write it.
I wanted to write the book because I feared that there was another coming farm crisis, and this was years ago. And it took me quite a while to free myself up to write a book and then to write it and get it published. And now there is a deep concern over the survival of today's family farmers. They're much diminished. They're still there. But I think society needs to step up and do everything they can to save family farms today. But back then, I had moved back to North Dakota from the East Coast, and I had already met up with the Farmers Home Administration because I'd been the head of Equal Credit Enforcement at the Federal Trade Equal Credit Opportunity Act enforcement at the FTC. And they were the biggest, baddest discriminators of all time, which wasn't right either, in that they were a federal agency. So at first it was one farmer, and that farmer told many other farmers, and all of a sudden I was back in North Dakota, and farmers were calling me from all over North Dakota, then all over the country. And they were all telling the same story about how they had borrowed money from the Farmers Home Administration, and now the Farmers Home Administration was trying to shut them down, even though they were just as productive as they had been when they got their loans. But the economy, and then there was also a election crackdown by the Reagan administration, David Stockman, and they wanted to reduce, like in a matter of months, the delinquencies and bring loans current. Well, the only way you could do that was by foreclosing. And that's what they proceeded to do. Thousands
And so
of foreclosures.
who are the North Dakota Nine? And how did they get?
Yeah, they were my lead plaintiffs. They were just normal farmers living in small towns around North Dakota. There were 9 of them, 4 women, 5 men, and they're listed alphabetically. Dwight Coleman with a C was the first listed. And I put them in the title because they're the heroes. They agreed to step up. Many of them, they thought it was too late for them. They didn't know how they would save their farm, but they thought, if they could prevent this from happening to other farmers, they wanted to do it. And they basically recognized it was like morally wrong what the government was doing to them and to so many other farmers. And so, yeah, the North Dakota Nine ended up as my lead class action named plaintiffs.
How'd you meet them? How did you meet them? How did you pick those 9 as opposed to there were thousands of small farmers in North Dakota, and it's, of course, as you'll tell us, the case eventually, went national, and it tried to stop foreclosures, the hundreds of thousands of foreclosures around the country. Was there anything particularly special about these 9 folks?
Yeah, they were. Well, they came to me relatively early. We went through the appeal process. I at the beginning, I was pretty optimistic. I didn't even see the need for a lot because I thought, we'll do these appeals, we'll bring this out. And then that's when I discovered another huge defect in the Farmers Home system, and that is that they had massively unconstitutional appeals processes with hearing officers that had actually made the decision that was under appeal. And
so the hearing officer was actually the person that had decided to throw them out in the first place?
Or the employee of that person, or they had signed off. Yeah. So they were not neutral, that is for sure. And then this looped me back to NYU and being a student at NYU when I was a member of the ACLU student chapter in Goldberg versus Kelly, a very, very famous due process case had just been decided. And so I went up to the Bronx and I learned about fair hearings. And then when I was back in North Dakota watching what was happening to these farmers, it was exactly, the unconstitutionality was obvious. So, it was a lot of it had to do, luckily, I had been in New York City at the time of Goldberg versus Kelly. And so that.
Which was 1965, right? Yeah.
1970 is when I graduated.
Yeah.
So
Goldberg was just a couple of years before that. So that was good timing. So tell me, or I'd love to hear it, and tell us about what NYU was like in those years. I started teaching at NYU in 1972, so you predate me at NYU. What about the school made it possible for you to do what you then did with this case?
Well, the school was Um, it was amazing. The teachers were so great. I was the only North Dakotan. I think I might have been the first North Dakotan to ever attend NYU. There was a group of I think we had about 30 women in a class of about 300. There were about 10% of us, and we were the largest women set of law students in the country ever. And we formed a women in the law class, but it was dramatic. We had a little apartment in Hayden Hall. I used to look out the window and be able to see riots on and pretty much any day. It was anti-war ferment and excitement. And coming from North Dakota, it was quite a dramatic change to go straight to the Greenwich Village in the anti-war days. And I loved every minute of my time in New York City, and the food.
Who'd you have for con law?
I had Norman Dorson,
Oh,
and he was so important to me because because he'd been to court, because he had done cases, and he would explain what he had done, the facts, that how he took it to the, so he created the impression as a teacher that a person, a lawyer, could make the Constitution come to life.
that's amazing.
And
Yeah.
that was such a lesson and such an inspiration.
Yeah,
And
that's something that you and I have shared for many, many years. Norman was the person who talked me into leaving the ACLU legal staff and go into teaching. And when he first raised it to me, just about at the same time, he raised it with me in 1972. I said, no, I don't want to teach. I want to get in there and do all I can to make things better. And he said, no, you can teach and do that. You can do both. And I said, well, show me somebody who does both. And he said, I do. and so he did. And so we share that, and that he had tremendous on our lives. So tell me about, go ahead.
I was going to ask, I wanted to tell the folks on this call how important it was that you came in as co-counsel. I had, for a long time, I was working alone. My dad did a rescue. Alan Canner, class action expert, came along. And then one day, I think it was the first day I'd been lost my own house. I had moved into my parents' basement with my young son. I was a single mom. And one day I got a call, and it was you, and you were saying, I want to help. I'm with the ACLU and I want to help. And that was a magic day.
Well, I wouldn't have made the call, one, if I hadn't really respected what you were doing, and two, if you hadn't been so absolutely courageous in what you did. So your personal circumstances when you started this challenge to the federal government, you had almost no financial backing, and you had nobody else to help you, right? I mean, you just did this alone when you started.
Yeah. It was even in North Dakota, lawyers, it had been almost 50 years since lawyers encountered broke farmers. Because the ag economy tends to go in cycles. Then since the 30s, farmers have been doing pretty well. And so people knew how to make mortgages, but they didn't know how to defend foreclosures. And actually, one of the things that was so appalling about the way this agency was treating farmers is that the first thing they did is starve the farmers out. They emptied the farmers' bank accounts, which they had the power to do. They cut off all loans. They seized all the crops, and then they told the farmers, you can have a hearing if you think we're wrong before a biased person in about 2, 3, 4 months. And
And
these
people
these
just, up,
Minnesota
huh?
nine,
Yeah.
they were so, farmers to then and now are so attached to their land, so attached, that they were actually sticking it out, managing to survive, fighting back against the starve out, fighting the federal government. So they were the inspiration to me. I had the good fortune of working with them, and actually, I was the only lawyer I think that was working with them, and it helped to be. Naivete was my secret weapon. I did not know it would be as difficult as it turned out to be.
And how come you chose federal court?
Well, it was the federal agency. We had to go to federal court. And my father, who was a highly esteemed lawyer, who was half frantic over what I was doing, recommended that we go to this particular judge in Western North Dakota called Judge Bruce M. Van Sickle. And he was just what a judge ought to be. He was neutral, he was fair, he had a sense of justice, and he was an amazing judge, and he issued a number of rulings in our favor, and ultimately we stopped. Well, when the national injunction went into effect, it stopped. I think it was 16,000 farms that were already in court or in foreclosure. Some states you didn't even have to go to court. And then there were tens of thousands more farmers who were being threatened. And nationwide, about half of the farmers that had borrowed from Farmers Home at the time were delinquent. So this ended up being a very, very, very big case.
Before you brought this case, had you ever brought a federal case before?
I never brought any case. I never watched a trial. I was.
Where did you get the guts just to stand up and throw yourself into the breach? I mean, you're right in describing it. There were no other resources for the farmers. But boy, most of the people I know would have said, well, that's too bad. There's nothing I can do about it. You just threw yourself into it. Where did you get the courage?
I don't know if it was courage or after a while, I was upset with the way the government was treating people. I had been raised to believe that the federal government should behave better than anybody else. And the way Farmers Home was behaving was so terrible. My father had been U.S. attorney, so I was raised to respect the federal government. I'd been in the federal government. I'd worked at Treasury and the Federal Trade Commission.
Did he ever try to talk you into coming to practice with him?
Oh, he was always after me to come and practice with him. But I guess I wanted to do my own thing. And, at the end of the day, basically when I'd lost my house and, I just couldn't make it at all anymore. And then I finally accepted my father's job offer. But, I knew that what I was doing was very impractical because my clients, by definition, couldn't pay. I mean, occasionally they'd say, well, we could sell a cow and give you the money. But if they had done that, that would have been a felony. So I said, no, don't even think of doing that. So, but the farmers are the ones that provided the impetus for me to keep going.
You were under tremendous personal financial pressure during this period, weren't you? I remember that you were worried about, you lost your house at some point. You were under enormous, you just kept going.
Well, after a while, it was a train I couldn't jump off. It was going too fast.
Tell us the first time that you thought you had a chance to win. I want to hear about your interactions with Judge Van Sickle. I mean, Judge, it turns out something very important, that the person that we really should be thanking is your father for directing the case to Van Sickle. It could have gone to another, it could have gone to at least one or two other federal judges in North Dakota who would not have been as friendly. So, tell me about Van Sickle himself. Do you know anything about?
Yeah, he grew up on a farm. He went to the University of Minnesota Law School. He was in the military. He was a Marine in World War II, so a bit of a hero, although he never talked about it. And he went back to his hometown of Minot, and he was a business lawyer, a banker, and this and that. He was in the legislature as a Republican. And then he was appointed to the federal bench by a Republican president. I can't remember which one. And but he was a very fair man. He had a deep and abiding belief in fairness. But the day that I knew that we were on a good track was after the statewide class action had been approved. And then Judge Van Sickle called the lawyers into a planning meeting, a conference. And he opened it up he was in his robes and we were in his back office. And the Department of Justice lawyers were there, the U.S. Attorney, a couple of them, and my father and I. And Judge Van Sickle, and this is in the transcript, said, all right, we have two parties in this case. We have the federal government, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Farmers Home Administration, and we have the victims. My dad and I were like, already. So,
I remember the first time I appeared before him. He said, "Who are you?" I said, "Well, I said I'm Bert Newborn. I'm here from New York to be of any help I can in the class action stuff." He said, "Oh well, I'm so glad we have somebody from the big city can come here and educate us and get us to do it right." And I'm thinking to myself, this guy knows more than I do.
well,
and he was a terrific judge. Really?
He was, and despite the importance of this Coleman versus Block case, he had another case that was even more important. It had to do with a lawsuit against the state of North Dakota by an association of basically parents and guardians of people who were incarcerated and kept under medievally bad conditions because they had disabilities or mental illnesses. And that case is the ARC case versus the state of North Dakota. That was even more important. So he had this other big class action going on at the same time. So he was not a newcomer to class actions, but when he said the victims, that was a beautiful moment, and it is in the transcript.
Yeah, well, of course, Sarah's strategy was, Van Sickle, the judge, was really a wonderful man. And we can't overstate the importance of having a decent person like that presiding over the case, because the case was pushing the boundaries. But I remember that Sarah's theory or Sarah's approach was to first get him interested in the nine, the actual people.
Mm-hmm.
To make it a case in which the lives of these people, the astonishing courage, and all they wanted to do was work 18 hours a day growing things. They were so dedicated to this life, and to first get him interested in the nine individuals, then hold out a hook to say, well, don't you want to help everybody in North Dakota? So now we would go to a North Dakota a class action, and then she pulled out from her little bag of tricks, well, why don't we make this a national class action, and we'll help everybody in the country? And she took him through three stages, and I was sort of busy watching as she took him through three stages: the personal stage, the state class action stage, and the national class action stage. And as you point out, Sarah, the final order that he issued froze 16,000 foreclosures around the country.
Yeah.
Um,
And then the clerk of court, when he issued the national class, the clerk of court did one of the most slick things I've ever seen. He sent the clerk of court sent out a notice to every other clerk of court in the country and said, and by the way, if you have any foreclosure cases, you can send them to us. I mean, with the Farmers Home Administration. So all over the country, judges were like, yay, yay, you know, because they had full dockets. They didn't want to do foreclosures, so they sent them. And then the injunction, and it ended up covering, I think it was 45 states and 46 states, but as a practical matter, it was all of the states where Farmers Home was lending. And oh my God, they didn't like us though, did they? Did they, Bert?
No, they were not happy with it. But the astonishing thing about this, I mean, you know that I've done cases like this all my career. The astonishing thing about this is I don't know of any other case that started with the kind of just individual courage and virtually no resources and grew into this enormous engine of justice for the family farmers. I mean, this is a story of what you can do when everything breaks right. When you have a courageous lawyer like you, when you have 9 remarkable plaintiffs like these, the North Dakota 9, when you have a decent judge, and when you have good class action law, you can put all that stuff together, and it becomes a great engine of justice. And I have some stuff I don't know that I want you to help fill in. So maybe we can, because you're right in saying that we've got a crisis again today. I mean, there is a crisis about the family farm, but more than that, there's a crisis about rural America, about that we don't have a national economic policy for rural America. We've spent a huge amount of effort worrying about urban America, tried very hard to deal with urban ills and manufacturing ills, but we just seem to think that the farms can take care of themselves. And a lot of it then turns out in bitterness and the terrible rural divide that we have in the country. So tell me about the Nonpartisan League. The Nonpartisan League was an effort at building grassroots democracy in rural America to do something about the economic. Where did it come from, and where is it today?
It came from farmers in about 1917 who had tried this and that, and then they came up with a platform that basically said that the state government should work on behalf of its people. And they felt that one of the ways of doing that would be to set up state-owned industries and have farmers elected to the legislature. But like today, even 100 years later, North Dakota has a state-owned Bank of North Dakota founded by the Nonpartisan League. We have a state mill, the largest mill, grain mill in North and South America, also owned by the state. And they set up a whole huge bunch of good laws that protected people as opposed to corporations. They passed an anti-corporate farming law. North Dakota still has that law. It's been amended over the years, but we still have that basic rule that corporations can't own farmland. What a difference that would make nationwide. And it's legal. It went up to the Supreme Court and back. It's approved. But the Nonpartisan League was a grassroots populist, prairie populist, and it grew like crazy. And then in World War I, it was knocked back by the well, I don't know. It was like a long story, but the League felt that there should be. They had the radical idea that there should be an income tax before there was a draft of young men. Mm-hmm. And that was deemed sedition. So they were prosecuted. The leaders were prosecuted for being seditionists. It's like quite the story. And then, but the League at one point in States, had 250,000 members, but its legacy lives on in these very good laws and these populist.
Is it, is it still a viable organization, or has it gone out of business?
It linked up with the Democratic Party in North Dakota about 40 years ago, and it's still there, although the Democratic Party is much diminished. But we're still there. It's the Democratic Nonpartisan League Party, and I'm a proud member of the Nonpartisan League. I'm still on the executive committee. There's 2 of us left.
Do you think it's possible to ignite a grassroots movement in rural America? I mean, is it possible to try to go back and rejuvenate institutions like the Nonpartisans League? I mean, I just worry that there's a great vacuum out there. There doesn't seem to be, much organization going on in rural America to try to develop a decent economic policy that would allow ordinary folks to live on the land.
Yeah, I think it is possible. It won't be easy. But I think that this whole focus on what is wrong with rural America, and my hypothesis is what is wrong. Why are all these small towns dying? Why are all these communities falling into despair? It's because they don't have the family farms surrounding them. There is a huge body of uncontested rural sociologist data, studies, reports, starting with Paul Taylor, who is married to the famous photographer, forgetting. But there's a huge amount of data that says that if you have family farms, you have healthy small towns. So that is the emphasis, I think, that should be placed. And I think the federal government should do everything that it can to preserve family farm agriculture. For environmental reasons, I mean, to me, well, all these farmers they were planting trees, they were taking care of the springs, they were taking care of the land, of the land and the streams, and because they wanted to pass it on to their kids. They're not going to be dumping toxic chemicals. They're not going to be offending their neighbors by putting in huge cesspools of pig waste that destroy the air in the neighborhood. Family farmers wouldn't do that, but they need public policy backup. And there are Senator Tester, Senator Booker, I think, are very much on that task right now. And there are many farm organizations that are working on that, but there are too few farmers these days to be that powerful a force. By the way, lots of big corporations, they'll impersonate farmers, but they're not. So you have to be a little careful on
So
who's
what finally happened to your 9, to the North Dakota 9? Is it a sad story? Is it a happy ending or a sad ending? Because
no, they were.
What about these individuals?
Okay, well, it's been a while. So some of them died. None of them lost their farms in the 80s. They all stayed on their farms. And Anna Mae Falmer, who was 92, passed away recently, and she still had her homestead and her barns and her land. Dwight Coleman kept his land for a long time. He sold it to some hunters because he was up in the hills and had beautiful streams and lakes and trees, and as well as the farmland. And then Don and Diane McCabe kept their farm for a long time, moved to Fargo, and did wonderful things there. So they all kept going, and as many of them did.
Did they trust you during the lawsuit? I mean, it's so hard to win the trust people who are in that position. Because after all, I know that when I went out there, I was just sort of parachuting in, and I would go back to New York City and I would do all I could, but I didn't share their life or their culture. And I had a sense that they viewed me as a useful person, but as an outsider. How did they deal with you?
They tended to trust me because we tended to have gone through lots of fights and battles together. The one I knew the least was the one I added the last, the ones I added the last, and they were Native American, because I knew that if Farmers Home was treating white farmers like this, they were treating Native Americans much worse, and that was also the case.
How did you how did you link up with Native American farmers?
Well, I had to send the word out. I told people that would know people that, North Dakota, it's a smaller place. You can do stuff like that. You can like call one person and say, by the way, I'm looking for blah, blah. And somebody always knows somebody who knows somebody. And like, indeed, I kept waiting for someone to call me. All these other farmers were calling, but I think the Native Americans were in a different communications area, more isolated. And so we reached out, or I reached out actually to try to find a Native American, and we found Lester and Sharon Crowshart. They still have their land. They're still up at Fort Berthold. They've got their land. So they were not going to lose their land. They've been farming and ranching and on that part of the Missouri River for millennia.
Do you ever hear from any of the farmers around the country outside of North Dakota that your lawsuit saved? You saved those farmers. Did you ever hear from any of them?
Yeah, I did. As I was Commissioner of Agriculture, traveling around and working on cases, many farmers came up to me and they would just real quietly say, "You saved our farm, thank you."
Yeah, you were the first woman to ever serve as a commissioner of agriculture of a state, weren't you?
Yeah, and I was elected, which was
you were elected twice.
Yeah.
What was it like being a woman in that world?
Well, it was interesting. I went to the National Association of State Department of Agriculture annual meeting for 8 years. And during those 8 years, I was the only woman at this table that held 49 people, because Arkansas didn't have an ag commissioner. But yeah, it was amazing. And I ended up being elected to the board and stuff like that. But yeah, there's another woman who's still my friend. She had been a deputy secretary of agriculture in North Dakota. And then she ran a bunch of groups, but we used to meet, we would be in a room of 200 men, and there would be Dina and me, and we're still friends. But yeah, it's not so bad today as it was then. But if I had a mission, I wanted to do these various things for family farmers, and that's what I tried to do.
Tell me about the women on the case. In other words, the 9 named plaintiffs.
Yeah.
They were all families, and they were all families with, as I met them, with extraordinarily strong women in the families.
Absolutely, yes. Well, I'll start with Anna Mae. Anna Mae handled all of the dairying, and not only did they handle part of the farming, they also were cooking and this and that, but they were like partners in the farm. Diane McCabe, who's in Fargo, she really resented being ignored, as they typically were. Then let's see, of Crowshart, I'm blanking on her first name, but yeah, they were the farmers in that culture. going back millennial, it was matriarchal farming.
So they made a movie about this case before you wrote the book.
Oh, yeah.
Jessica Lange starred in a movie called Country, which was supposedly a dramatization of the book. It really doesn't have much to do with the book, but what do you think of it?
Oh, I loved it. I loved that movie. The first time I saw it, I started to cry in the opening credits, and I cried through the whole movie because it brought so many things back. But Jessica Lange deserves immense credit. She did the book before, I mean, she was working on the movie while the case was being filed and going on. I had sent her affidavits because her sister Jane was my college roommate, so we had that connection. And but she did research. She went down to Iowa. She talked to farmers down there who were going through this, and they did the movie. It's fictionalized, but it's historic. It's like
It's amazingly moving. And you should know, I mean, the people who are on this webcast should know that the movie ends with a text screen across it, describing the case and describing Sarah's win and describing the fact that family farmers were saved by
yeah, it was so stunning. Because the people, the Ivy family, who are the main characters in Jessica Lange's movie, could have been plaintiffs in my case. They were members of the class without a doubt. And it sort of shows the human level of suffering. And but yeah, I wanted to put the North Dakota 9 in because of their courage and stepping up and being lead plaintiffs in a very difficult case. And, given people's shame over being unable to pay their bills, for example, that was pretty tough. But Russell Falmer told me one time, I'll never forget it, when I called to say, will you be a lead plaintiff? You don't have to pay me, but will you be a lead plaintiff? And they all said yes. And Russell said, it may be too late for me, but if I can help someone else from having this happen to them, I will do it. So they're doing it not so much for themselves as for other people and for justice. And they did end.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, and at the risk of electrocuting myself, every time I touch my laptop trying to use technology, I do something wrong. I want to try to see if we can open up some questions from the audience and for you, Sarah. Okay, so let me see what it looks like. If I disappear in a puff of white smoke, you'll know I put the wrong button.
Okay.
So here we got a lawyer here. We need a lawyer's asking a lawyer's question. What was the cause of action for the original lawsuit? What was the legal theory for the original lawsuit? And I'm going to answer live. Go ahead.
There were two principal causes of action. One was Congress had passed a law in 1978 that said that in lieu of foreclosure, the federal government could give deferrals to farmers in lieu of foreclosure. And USDA had refused to implement that law. So we tried to get an order to make USDA follow that law by issuing regulations and procedures. And then the second part was pure due process of law, that the process that Farmers Home was using was unconstitutional, that the hearing officers were biased, that starving the farmers out months before they could even have a hearing was unconstitutional. So there was this.
And that's where you were borrowing from Goldberg versus Kelly.
Precisely. Yes. Yes.
And how long did the case? The same questioner wants to know, how long did the case run before you finally got a victory from Judge Vince?
Well, it wasn't very long because I worked undercover. We worked kind of quietly, and it was a very frustrating period of time because I felt I had to build the case and like spring it on the federal government because they had armies of lawyers. So we did that. We filed all our briefs. We had our class action ready to go. We had the complaint perfect. We had the motions for preliminary injunction and class certification. We had all that ready. And we filed like a stack of stuff like this and gave the government 30 days to respond, which they did poorly, which was a good strategy. And so we got the class certified within, I think it was a couple months.
I was particularly interested. The reason I reached out to you, I don't know if I've ever talked to you about this, but the reason I reached out to you, I was National Legal Director of the ACLU during those years, and I was trying very hard to push the ACLU into doing more economic justice cases. I was, what we were doing was wonderful, and I was very proud of it, but I wanted to try to force some more economic justice onto the docket. And I saw this case as a way of showing the board and showing everybody else that you could use Goldberg versus Kelly. You could use the 14th Amendment and the Due Process Clause, classic constitutional litigation, classic ACLU concerns, but you could use it in a way that would advance economic justice by saying to the government, you can't foreclose on these small farmers unless you give them a real due process hearing. And if you give them a real due process hearing, they're going to give you the fight of your life before you can finally push them off their land. So your theory, when you said Goldberg versus Kelly to me, a light went on. I said, sure, we can do that.
And it was like, and I felt like the cavalry came. And then when we went for the national class action, and you were able to stand up in court and say to Judge Van Sickle, not only will I help on this case, but I'm also volunteering this entire army of, I think you had 70 lawyers working with you at the time. You said, I'll bring in 70 lawyers. And then you said, and every other volunteer lawyer that the ACLU had. But you said that to Judge Van Sickle, and
we're going to throw the entire ACLU program into this case because, because the judge was wavering. He said, look, I feel comfortable having a North Dakota class because I feel comfortable that Sarah will take care of, you and Alan will take care of the North Dakota stuff. But if I go nationwide, how do I know what's going to happen?
yeah.
I don't know whether there's somebody in Georgia who'll pick up the ball or Arizona. And I'm not talking to the board and not having the authorization. I committed the entire land and naval forces of the ACLU struggle.
Yeah. And it made a difference. I think at that point, Judge Van Sickle goes, okay, then.
Yeah, and it turned out we didn't, because Van Sickle ran the thing very well by himself. He was
yeah, he did. He did. He was the thumb in the dike for a long time. And then I don't want to not mention that there had to be another case, Coleman too, because then USDA tried to change the regulations and, like undercut the law by changing the regulations. And then the Farmers Legal Action Group stepped in and you stayed on. I went off to become an assistant attorney general. But you and Alan stayed on, and the litigation, a new Coleman 2, I call it, went on for years. And then that culminated in a humongous law in 1988, the 87 Ag Credit Act, that basically tried to fix it and then made the Coleman due process provisions into permanent law.
Yeah, I should have said that. I should have pointed out that you were one of the first lawyers who was able to link a nationwide class action into congressional reform, that it really grew into major congressional reform, which supposedly changed at least the credit and the status of small farmers before the administration. So we've just got a couple minutes left, and what's the biggest issue facing small farmers today? If you could pick one thing that you wanted to have people work on and think about to help a small farmer, what would it be?
Well, they're in a tremendous cost price squeeze. They're as productive as can be. They're the most productive people in the farming sector, much more productive than corporate agriculture, but they're caught in a cost price squeeze. Inputs are very expensive, and then the what they get for their crops, and a lot of that is due to failure for decades and decades and decades of antitrust law enforcement. There are very few suppliers and there are very few buyers, and farmers are caught in the squeeze. So I would hate to say there's one thing to be done, because there's so many kinds of farming and so many situations, but there are organizations that are working on this very, very, very hard across the country. And so I have some of them listed on my website, sarahamvogel.com. But people need to stick up for farmers. So what I'm telling people now is that when a politician comes to you and says, vote for me, you say, well, that's very nice, but what are you doing for family farmers? And make that a topic with every single politician in America. What are you doing for family farmers?
Just going to try to see whether we have any more live questions here. No, Susan Della Ross, who was your classmate in 1970, says hello, and that she's, delighted to see you. So happy and successful. So hi, Susan, I remember you too.
Yeah, Susan, last time we connected, I was representing farmers in America, and she was representing women farmers in Africa, which is pretty cool. And the Women in the Law club, we called it, was extremely important to me my whole lifetime.
Well, I'll close this session by saying something that hasn't been written but should. When the history of NYU Law School gets written, NYU was, sort of rocketed up from being a very good New York law school to being one of the great law schools in the world. And when we try to, we try to figure out why NYU? Why did NYU take off that way? And it's clear to me that what happened was NYU, as you pointed out, you were the probably largest group of women law students in the single place anywhere, and you were only 30 back in 1970. NYU was the first major school to go gender blind in admissions. That they just, said, we don't care what the class looks like in terms of gender. We just want the very best people. So we went gender blind. And when I started in 72, by the time I was there in 74, and by the time I got tenure in 76, women made up just over half of the class.
Wow.
But they were an amazing half of the class. Many of them were older women who came because they thought they couldn't be lawyers. And then all of a sudden, society caught up with them, and feminism made it possible a couple of years late. And so they were older, more experienced, incredibly dedicated and motivated. And they dominated the class. They dominated the law review, they dominated the classroom discussion, and they picked us up and put us on their shoulders. And they raised the whole aspirations of the place. And NYU got to be a better law school because it did the right thing by admitting women in large numbers for the first time. And once you do that, once you change the intellectual climate and aspirational goals and self-interest of an institution, it doesn't easily go back. And so we just kept going forward. But it was women that did it. And
cool.
So it's been great.
Well, it was an incredible education that I got, and all of the teachers were fabulous. And then they lost me for years and years and years because I changed my name and this and that. And I'm really glad to reconnect after all these years back with NYU.
Great.
And
Well, so thank you, Sarah, so much for a wonderful evening and for being who you've been and who you are. I mean, I'm proud to have known you and proud to have worked with you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for all your help back then and all your great work you've done, Bert.
Thank you both so much for this wonderful conversation. It's been such a treat to be able to host the conversation, to be able to share Sarah's book and Sarah's work with our wonderful community. And thanks to Professor Newborn for your thoughts on NYU law, and particularly love as the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network to share this history of NYU law's spectacular women students. So thank you for that as well. Again, for our audience, the book is The Farmer's Lawyer, the North Dakota Nine and the Fight to Save the Family Farm. And thanks to our co-sponsors, the State Energy and Environmental Impact Center and the Institute for Public Knowledge. So thank you to our audience for joining us. We hope you'll join us at the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network for future events, and have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you again to Bert and Sarah, and we'll see you soon. Take care.